So here's something worth thinking about as you're lying there, getting comfortable, letting the day wind down. Right now, in this moment, there are billions of tiny switches flipping on and off inside the device playing this for you. Billions, not hundreds, not thousands. Billions with a B. And every single one of those switches is doing something almost absurdly simple. Each one is either on or it's off. That's it. There's no in-between, no maybe, no sort of. Just on or off, yes or no, 1 or 0. And yet somehow, from that incredibly basic act, a switch being on or a switch being off, you get everything. You get music and video and language and maps and messages from people you love. You get weather predictions and medical diagnoses and the ability to talk face to face with someone on the other side of the planet. All of it, every single bit of it, comes down to switches flipping between two states. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. How computers think. Or, well, I should be careful with that word think, because whether computers actually think is a whole philosophical rabbit hole we don't need to fall into right now. What we're really going to explore is how computers do what they do. How they take those absurdly simple on-off signals and somehow build them up layer by layer into the extraordinary machines that run the modern world. And we're going to do it slowly, from the very beginning, tracing the whole story from the first time a human being had the wild idea that maybe, just maybe, you could build a machine that could reason. But let's not start with computers. Let's start with fingers. Seriously, let's start there, because that's where counting started. And counting is the foundation of everything that comes after. The word digit, which we use for the numerals 0 through 9, comes from the Latin word for finger, digitus, and that's not a coincidence. When early humans needed to keep track of things, how many sheep in the flock, how many days until the river floods, how many enemies on the ridge, they used what they had. Their fingers, 10 fingers, 10 symbols. That's why we use a base 10 number system. Not because 10 is mathematically special, it isn't, really, but because we happen to have 10 fingers. If we'd evolved with 8 fingers, we'd probably count in base 8, and our computers might look a little different. Or maybe not. We'll come back to that. The point is, humans have been trying to make counting easier for a very, very long time. One of the oldest tools we know of is the abacus, and versions of it show up independently in Mesopotamia, China, Greece, Rome, basically everywhere humans settled down and started trading goods. The Mesopotamian abacus dates back to around 2700 BCE, maybe earlier. And here's the thing about the abacus that's easy to overlook. It's not just a counting aid, it's a calculating tool. A skilled abacus operator can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with remarkable speed. There are competitions even today where abacus users go head-to-head with people using electronic calculators, and the abacus users sometimes win. Not because the abacus is faster than electronics, it isn't, but because a practiced human brain working with a physical tool can be astonishingly quick. But the abacus has a limitation. It needs a human to operate it. Every bead that slides along that rod is moved by a human hand, guided by a human mind. The abacus doesn't do anything on its own. It's a tool, not a machine. And the difference between a tool and a machine, that distinction matters enormously for our story. A tool helps you do work. A machine does work for you, following a set of instructions, a mechanism, a predetermined sequence. The entire history of computing is really the story of crossing that line, going from tools that help humans calculate to machines that calculate on their own. Now, for a long time, nobody even thought that line could be crossed. Calculation was a human activity. In fact, the word computer originally referred to a person, someone whose job it was to compute. Rooms full of human computers worked on everything from astronomical tables to artillery trajectories, and we'll come back to them later because their story is fascinating and a little heartbreaking. But for now, just hold on to that idea. For most of history, if you wanted something calculated, you needed a person to do it. The first real crack in that assumption came in the early 1600s, and it came from a place you might not expect, a teenager trying to help his father with tax collection. The teenager was Blaise Pascal. Yes, that Blaise Pascal, the one you might know from philosophy, the Pascal's wager guy, or from physics, where the unit of pressure is named after him. Pascal was born in 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand, France, and by all accounts, he was one of those almost frighteningly precocious children. His father, Etienne, was a tax commissioner, and the job involved an enormous amount of arithmetic, just grinding, tedious, error-prone addition and subtraction over and over, all day long. And young Blaise, watching his father struggle with this, decided to build a machine that could do it. He was 19 years old. Think about that. 19. And he's designing a mechanical calculator from scratch, with no real precedent to work from. The machine he built, called the Pascaline, used a series of interlocking gears, toothed wheels, basically, arranged so that when one wheel completed a full rotation, it would advance the next wheel by one position. It's the same principle as an odometer in a car, if you've ever watched one of those old mechanical odometers roll over from 99,999 to 100,000. Each digit wheel is connected to the next, and when one completes a cycle, it carries over to the next column. That carrying, that automatic carrying from ones to tens to hundreds, was the key innovation. That's what made the Pascaline more than just a fancy abacus. It mechanized the carry operation, which is the part of addition that's most error-prone when humans do it by hand. Pascal built about 50 of these machines between 1642 and 1645, and they worked. They actually worked. But here's the thing. They were expensive. They were fragile. They were difficult to manufacture with the metalworking technology of the time, and honestly, most people didn't see the point. Skilled human computers could do the same work faster and cheaper. The Pascaline was a marvel, a proof of concept, a glimpse of the future, but it wasn't practical. Not yet. The world wasn't ready for it, and in some ways the technology wasn't ready either. The precision required to make those gears mesh perfectly, every single time, without jamming or skipping. That was at the very edge of what 17th century craftsmen could achieve. About 30 years later, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German mathematician and philosopher, and one of the most genuinely brilliant people who has ever lived, took Pascal's idea further. Leibniz built a machine called the stepped reckoner around 1694, which could not only add and subtract, but also multiply and divide. It used a clever mechanism called a Leibniz wheel, which was a cylinder with teeth of varying lengths along its surface. By shifting the position of a smaller gear relative to this stepped cylinder, you could set different digit values, and the machine would mechanically perform multiplication through repeated addition. It was ingenious. It was also, honestly, kind of unreliable. The stepped reckoner had problems with its carry mechanism, ironically, the same operation Pascal had solved so elegantly, and it never really worked perfectly in practice. Leibniz himself acknowledged the issues but argued correctly that the principle was sound even if the execution was flawed. And here's something about Leibniz that's going to matter a lot more later in our story. In 1679, he wrote a paper describing a complete system of arithmetic using only two symbols, 1 and 0. Binary arithmetic. He wasn't the first person to notice that you could represent numbers in base 2. That idea had been floating around. But he was the first to really formalize it, to work out the rules for addition, subtraction, and multiplication in binary, and to argue that this system had a kind of elegant simplicity that base 10 lacked. He even corresponded with Jesuit missionaries in China who told him about the I Ching, the ancient Chinese text that uses broken and unbroken lines, essentially zeros and ones, to represent all possible states of change. Leibniz was fascinated by this. He saw a deep connection between his binary arithmetic and what he interpreted as an ancient philosophical system. Now, Leibniz didn't connect binary arithmetic to computing machines. That leap wouldn't happen for another 250 years. But just think about what he'd laid out. He'd built a mechanical calculator, and separately, he'd described a number system that uses only two states, on or off, 1 or 0. The two ideas were sitting right next to each other, like two puzzle pieces on the same table, and nobody put them together. Not yet. Let's stay in this era for a moment, because there's something important happening beneath the surface. Throughout the 1700s, the demand for calculation was exploding. Navigation required better astronomical tables. Artillery required better ballistic calculations. Trade and finance required better actuarial tables. Governments needed census data. Science needed logarithm tables. And all of this calculating was being done by hand, by those human computers I mentioned earlier. Rooms full of people, often women, often poorly paid, working through calculations step by step, checking and rechecking each other's work, and still making errors. Because humans make errors. It's not a flaw in any individual person. It's just a fundamental limitation of human attention. Do the same repetitive task for 8 hours straight, and you will make mistakes. It's inevitable, and those mistakes had consequences. A wrong number in a navigation table could send a ship onto rocks. A wrong number in a logarithm table could cascade through every calculation that depended on it. The French government, in the 1790s, commissioned an enormous project to recalculate all the mathematical tables the country needed, using a system designed by Gaspard de Prony. De Prony's insight was to break complex calculations down into simple steps, mostly just addition and subtraction, and then assign each step to a different group of workers. The workers at the bottom of the hierarchy didn't need to understand the mathematics at all. They just needed to add numbers over and over, following instructions. It was, in a very real sense, a human assembly line for computation, and it worked reasonably well, but it was slow, expensive, and still subject to errors when the results were transcribed in typeset for printing. This is the world that Charles Babbage was born into. London, 1791. And Babbage. Oh, Babbage is a character. He was brilliant, cantankerous, obsessive, ahead of his time in ways that were almost cruel, because he could see exactly what needed to be built, but lived in an era that couldn't quite build it. He's often called the father of the computer, and that title is more or less deserved, though like all such titles, it simplifies a complicated story. Babbage was a mathematician at Cambridge, and he was deeply, personally frustrated by errors in mathematical tables. There's a famous story, and like many famous stories, the exact details are debated, but the spirit of it is true. That one day in 1821 or so, Babbage was reviewing a set of astronomical calculations with his friend John Herschel, the astronomer, and they kept finding mistakes. And Babbage reportedly said something like, I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam, meaning by a machine, by something that wouldn't get tired, wouldn't lose focus, wouldn't transpose 2 digits because it was thinking about lunch. And that frustration became the driving obsession of his life. Babbage designed a machine he called the difference engine, and the name tells you what it does. It computes using the method of finite differences, which is a mathematical technique that lets you calculate the values of polynomial functions using only repeated addition. Remember de Prony's human computers, the ones who only needed to add? Same principle, but mechanized. The difference engine would take a set of initial values, and then through a cascade of addition operations performed by brass gears and columns of numbered wheels, it would automatically generate table after table of perfectly accurate values. And this is the part that really mattered to Babbage. It would stamp those values directly into copper plates, ready for printing. No human transcription, no typesetting errors. The machine would calculate and record in one seamless process. Babbage got funding from the British government in 1823, a substantial grant, the equivalent of millions in today's money. And he set to work with a brilliant engineer named Joseph Clement. And for a while, things went well. A small demonstration piece was built, and it worked beautifully. The precision of the gears, the elegance of the mechanism, people who saw it were astonished. But then things started to go wrong, in the way that ambitious engineering projects often go wrong. The full machine required thousands of precision-machined parts, to tolerances that pushed the limits of what was possible. Babbage and Clement argued over costs, over workshop ownership, over intellectual property. The project dragged on. The budget ballooned. The government got nervous. And then Babbage did something that, depending on your perspective, was either visionary genius or catastrophic self-sabotage. He stopped working on the difference engine and started designing something far more ambitious. Something that, if it had been built, would have been the first true computer, more than 100 years before the word meant what it means today. Babbage called it the analytical engine. And here's what separates it from everything that came before. Everything. The difference engine, for all its ingenuity, could do one thing. It could compute tables using the method of finite differences. You set it up, you cranked it, and it produced a specific kind of output. It was a calculator. A brilliant, automatic, self-printing calculator, but still a calculator. The analytical engine was something else entirely. It was a general-purpose computing machine. It could, in principle, perform any mathematical operation in any sequence, determined not by the physical arrangement of its gears, but by a set of instructions fed into the machine from outside. Let that sink in for a second. This is the 1830s. Victoria isn't even queen yet, and Charles Babbage is sketching out the architecture of a programmable computer using nothing but mechanical parts. The design had 4 main components, and if you know anything about modern computers, these are going to sound eerily familiar. First, there was what Babbage called the store, a place to hold numbers. That's memory. Then there was the mill, the part that actually performed arithmetic operations on those numbers. That's the processor, the central processing unit. There was an input mechanism, which read instructions and data into the machine, and there was an output mechanism, which delivered results. Input, memory, processing, output. That's the architecture of every computer you've ever used, from the mainframe that ran your bank's first database to the phone on your nightstand right now. Babbage saw it. He saw the whole shape of it, in brass and iron and steam. Now, for the input mechanism, Babbage borrowed an idea from an unexpected source, the textile industry. There was a loom invented by a Frenchman named Joseph-Marie Jacquard around 1804 that used punched cards to control the pattern of the weave. Each card had holes in specific positions, and depending on where the holes were, different hooks would engage, lifting different threads, creating different patterns in the fabric. Change the cards, change the pattern. The loom didn't care what pattern you wanted. It just followed the instructions encoded in the cards. Babbage looked at that and thought, I can do the same thing with numbers. I can encode mathematical operations on punched cards, feed them into my engine, and the machine will execute whatever sequence of calculations the cards describe. One set of cards for the operations: add, subtract, multiply, divide. Another set for which numbers in the store to use. The machine becomes infinitely flexible. It's not locked into one task. It's programmable. And this is where one of the most remarkable figures in the entire history of computing enters the story. Her name was Ada Lovelace, born Augusta Ada Byron. Yes, the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet. Byron was famously described as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and he left Ada's mother when Ada was just a few weeks old. Her mother, Annabella Milbank, was terrified that Ada might inherit her father's volatile, poetic temperament, so she did something unusual for the time. She had Ada educated rigorously in mathematics and science as a kind of antidote to poetry, which is a fascinating idea in itself, that you could use mathematics to inoculate a child against imagination. But what actually happened was something more interesting. Ada developed both. She had a deeply mathematical mind and a profoundly creative one, and that combination turned out to be exactly what Babbage's analytical engine needed. Ada met Babbage when she was 17 at a party in 1833, and he showed her the working portion of the difference engine. She was captivated. Over the following years, she and Babbage developed a deep intellectual friendship. And in 1842, when an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea published a description of the analytical engine based on lectures Babbage had given in Turin, Ada was asked to translate it from French into English. She did. And then she added her own notes, which ended up being about 3 times longer than the original article. Those notes are extraordinary. In them, Ada laid out, with remarkable clarity, what the analytical engine could do, and, just as importantly, what it could not do. She described how the machine could be instructed to perform a complex sequence of operations, with the results of one operation feeding into the next. She included what is widely regarded as the first computer program ever written, a detailed step-by-step algorithm for the engine to compute Bernoulli numbers, which are a sequence that shows up in number theory and analysis. She worked out the operation cards, the variable cards, the whole sequence. It was a real program, with what we'd now call loops and conditional branching implied in its structure. But here's what's really remarkable about Ada's thinking. She saw past the mathematics to something deeper. She wrote that the engine could potentially act upon other things besides number, if those things could be represented by the engine's operations. She imagined it might compose music, produce graphics, be used for scientific purposes beyond pure calculation. She was glimpsing, in 1843, the idea that a computing machine is not just a number cruncher. It's a symbol manipulator. It can work with anything that can be encoded as information. That insight wouldn't be fully developed for another 100 years. She also, by the way, explicitly said that the engine could not originate anything. It could only do what it was instructed to do. which is a statement people still argue about in the context of artificial intelligence. Ada's objection, as it's sometimes called: can a machine truly think, or does it only follow instructions? We're still wrestling with that one, aren't we? So Babbage had the vision, Ada had the insight, and between them they had described, on paper, a machine that wouldn't actually be built for over a century. Because here's the sad part of this story. The analytical engine was never completed. Babbage spent the rest of his life refining the designs, filling notebook after notebook with increasingly detailed mechanical drawings. The designs are astonishing in their complexity and their completeness, but he couldn't get funding. The British government, burned by the difference engine debacle, wasn't about to write another check. Babbage grew increasingly difficult and isolated. He railed against organ grinders in the streets of London, literally campaigned to have street musicians banned, which made him deeply unpopular. He died in 1871, and most of his work was forgotten or ignored for decades. And Ada died even earlier, in 1852, at just 36, from cancer. She never saw any of her ideas realized in physical form. The two of them, Babbage and Lovelace, were simply too far ahead of their time. The manufacturing precision needed, the materials, the engineering infrastructure, none of it existed yet. They could see the destination, but the road wasn't built. Now, let's step back for a moment and think about what's happened so far in our story. We started with the idea that all computing is, at bottom, about representing information and manipulating it according to rules. We saw how humans did this with abacuses, with mental arithmetic, with rooms full of human computers doing addition by hand. We saw how Pascal and Leibniz built machines that could automate individual arithmetic operations. And we saw how Babbage and Lovelace imagined a machine that could perform any computation, directed by external instructions. The trajectory is clear, from manual to mechanical to programmable. But there's a missing piece. All of these machines, real or imagined, were decimal. They worked in base 10, with gears that had 10 positions, with wheels that carried from 9 to 0. And remember Leibniz and his binary arithmetic? He'd shown, back in 1679, that you could represent any number using just ones and zeros. But nobody had connected that idea to computing machinery. Not yet. That connection, the one that would eventually make modern computers possible, required a detour through a completely different field. Not mathematics, not mechanical engineering, but logic. Pure, abstract, philosophical logic. In 1847, a self-taught English mathematician named George Boole published a short book called The Mathematical Analysis of Logic. Boole came from a working-class family in Lincoln, England. His father was a cobbler who loved science and mathematics, but never had the means to pursue them formally. George was largely self-educated, teaching himself Latin, Greek, French, German, and eventually advanced mathematics, all while working as a school teacher from the age of 16. He never attended university as a student, but he was so brilliant that he was eventually appointed professor of mathematics at Queen's College Cork in Ireland, which was remarkable for someone without a degree. What Boole did was something that sounds simple, but was genuinely revolutionary. He showed that logical reasoning, the kind of reasoning you do when you say, if this is true and that is true, then this other thing must be true, could be expressed as a form of algebra. He created a mathematical system where the values weren't ordinary numbers, but truth values, true and false, which he represented as 1 and 0. And the operations weren't addition and multiplication in the usual sense, but logical operations, and or not. If A is true and B is true, then A and B is true. If A is true or B is true, then A or B is true. If A is true, then not A is false. Simple rules, but Boole showed that you could combine them to express enormously complex logical statements, and you could manipulate those statements using algebraic rules just like you manipulate equations. Think about what that means. Boole took human reasoning, the messy, intuitive process of figuring out what follows from what, and turned it into mathematics, into symbol manipulation, into something a machine could, in principle, do. He probably didn't think of it that way. Boole was interested in the nature of thought itself, in understanding the laws of thought, which was actually the title of his more complete 1854 book. He wanted to understand logic, not build machines. But he'd created the mathematical foundation that would eventually make digital computing possible. And here's the beautiful connection. Remember that binary is a number system with just 2 digits, 0 and 1. And Boolean logic is a system with just 2 values, true and false, also represented as 0 and 1. That's not a coincidence. It's the deep structural link that makes everything work. A switch that's either on or off. A value that's either true or false. A digit that's either 1 or 0. They're all the same thing, seen from different angles. And once someone saw that you could use physical switches to implement Boolean logic, and use Boolean logic to perform arithmetic, and use arithmetic to compute anything computable, the entire architecture of the modern computer would snap into focus. But that realization took decades. Boole died young in 1864 at 49, caught in a rainstorm walking to class, lectured in wet clothes, developed pneumonia, and his wife, who believed in unconventional medicine, apparently wrapped him in wet sheets because she thought the cure should resemble the cause. He died shortly after. His work was respected, but not widely applied. It sat there, in the mathematical literature, a beautiful theoretical framework waiting for someone to see its practical implications. That someone, or rather, those someones, wouldn't come along until the 1930s, and when they did, they came from multiple directions at once, which is one of those wonderful patterns in the history of ideas. When the time is ripe, when the surrounding knowledge and technology reach a certain point, the same insight tends to occur to several people independently. It happened with calculus, Newton and Leibniz, working separately. It happened with evolution, Darwin and Wallace. And it happened with the theoretical foundations of computing. But before we get to that extraordinary decade, there's one more thread we need to pick up, because it runs right through the heart of everything that follows. And that's the story of electricity, specifically, the story of how people learned to use electrical signals to carry information over long distances, and how that technology created the physical hardware that would eventually make Boolean logic something you could literally build with your hands. So let's talk about electricity, not the whole history. That would take us all night in a different way. But the specific thread that matters here, the part about switches. For most of human history, electricity was a curiosity. People knew about lightning, they knew about static. The ancient Greeks noticed that rubbing amber with fur could make it attract small objects. And in fact, the word electricity comes from the Greek word for amber, electron. But nobody could do anything useful with it until the late 1700s and early 1800s, when a rapid series of discoveries gave us batteries, circuits, and eventually electromagnets. And electromagnets are the key to our story, because an electromagnet is, at its heart, a switch you can control with electricity. Here's how it works. You take a piece of iron, a nail will do, and you wrap wire around it. lots of coils of wire. When you send electric current through that wire, the iron becomes magnetic. It attracts other pieces of iron. When you cut the current, the magnetism goes away, and whatever was being attracted drops. On, off. Current flowing, current not flowing. Magnetic, not magnetic. You see where this is going. It's a physical, tangible binary state, controlled remotely by electricity. The person who turned this into something world-changing was an American named Samuel Morse. Well, Morse and his collaborator Alfred Vail, who honestly deserves more credit than he usually gets. In the 1830s and 40s, they developed the electric telegraph, a system where you press a key at one end of a wire, current flows through the wire to the other end, and an electromagnet at the receiving end clicks. Press the key, the magnet pulls a little lever down and makes a sound. Release the key, the lever springs back up. Short press, long press, dot, dash, Morse code. The first practical telegraph line in America ran from Washington to Baltimore, and on May 24, 1844, Morse sent the famous message, "What hath God wrought?" Now, the telegraph itself isn't a computer. It's a communication device. But it introduced something absolutely critical to the development of computing, and that's the electromagnetic relay. See, the problem with sending electrical signals over long distances is that the signal gets weaker the farther it travels. The wire has resistance, the current diminishes, and eventually the electromagnet at the other end doesn't get enough juice to click. So telegraph engineers came up with a brilliant solution: the relay. A relay is an electromagnet that, when it activates, physically closes another switch, which is connected to a fresh battery and a new stretch of wire. So a weak incoming signal triggers the relay, and the relay sends out a strong, fresh signal on the next segment. It's like a chain of runners passing a baton. Each runner is fresh, even though the message has been traveling a long distance. But here's the thing about a relay that matters for computing. A relay is a switch. It's a switch that can be opened or closed by an electrical signal rather than by a human finger, which means you can use the output of one relay to control the input of another relay. You can chain them together. You can build circuits where the state of one switch determines the state of another switch, which determines the state of a third switch, and so on. And if you're very clever about how you wire them together, you can make those chains of switches perform logic. Think about that for a second. If you wire two relay switches in series, one after the other, so current has to flow through both of them to reach the output, then the output is only on when both switches are closed. Both must be true. That's an AND gate. If you wire two relays in parallel, side by side, so current can flow through either one to reach the output, then the output is on when either switch is closed. That's an OR gate. And if you wire a relay so that it's normally closed and opens when you send it a signal, that's a NOT gate. It inverts the input. And right there, with those three configurations, you have all of Boolean logic implemented in physical hardware. George Boole's AND, OR, and NOT, built out of copper wire and iron cores and little spring-loaded levers. This is the connection that had been missing for 70 years. Boole published his logic in the 1850s. Relays existed by the 1840s, but nobody put them together. Nobody looked at a relay and thought, that's a logic gate. Nobody looked at Boolean algebra and thought, I could build that out of telegraph parts. The theoretical framework and the physical hardware existed side by side for decades, like two puzzle pieces lying on the same table, and nobody picked them up and snapped them together. Until Claude Shannon. Shannon is one of those figures in the history of technology who deserves to be a household name and somehow isn't. Born in 1916 in Petoskey, Michigan, a small town in the northern part of the state. His father was a judge, his mother was a language teacher, and eventually became the principal of the local high school. As a kid, Shannon loved building things. He built a telegraph system between his house and a friend's house using barbed wire from nearby fences as the transmission line. He built model planes. He tinkered with radio equipment. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of kid who grows up to change the world. Curious, hands-on, comfortable with both theory and physical stuff. He went to the University of Michigan, where he got 2 bachelor's degrees, one in electrical engineering and one in mathematics. 2 different disciplines, 2 different ways of thinking, and that combination turned out to be the whole ballgame. Because after Michigan, Shannon went to MIT for graduate school, and there he encountered a very specific problem. He was working with a machine called the differential analyzer, which was a mechanical analog computer built by Vannevar Bush. It was this room-sized contraption of gears and shafts and wheels that could solve differential equations, and it was controlled by a complicated arrangement of electrical relays. Shannon's job was partly to work on the relay circuits, and as he studied them, something clicked. He realized that the behavior of relay circuits, which combinations of open and closed switches produce which outputs, could be described perfectly using Boolean algebra. The thing that Boole had created as an abstract system of logic, purely mathematical, purely theoretical, mapped exactly onto the physical behavior of electrical switches. Shannon wrote this up in his master's thesis in 1937, and it's been called the most important master's thesis of the 20th century, which honestly might be underselling it. The title was A Symbolic Analysis of Relay and Switching Circuits, and in it, Shannon showed that you could use Boolean algebra to design and simplify relay circuits, and conversely, that you could use relay circuits to compute any Boolean function. Let that sink in for a moment. What Shannon did was build the bridge. On one side, you had Boole's abstract logic, and, or not, true, false, ones and zeros. On the other side, you had physical electrical switches, relays that were open or closed, circuits that carried current or didn't. Shannon proved they were the same thing. He gave engineers a mathematical tool for designing circuits, and he gave mathematicians a physical substrate for implementing logic. And since Boole had already shown that logic could express arithmetic, and since arithmetic is the foundation of computation, Shannon had effectively shown that you could compute with electricity. He was 21 years old when he wrote that thesis. Now, here's one of those beautiful convergences I mentioned. While Shannon was having his insight at MIT, other people in other places were arriving at related ideas from completely different starting points. And the most important of these, arguably the most important theoretical contribution to computer science ever, came from a young British mathematician named Alan Turing. Turing's story starts in a very different place from Shannon's. Where Shannon was an engineer who saw the practical connection between logic and circuits, Turing was a pure mathematician who was thinking about the deepest possible question in his field. What does it mean for something to be computable? Is there a precise definition of computation itself? This question had been sharpened by a challenge posed by the great German mathematician David Hilbert. In 1928, Hilbert asked what's called the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. Essentially, is there a mechanical procedure, an algorithm, that can determine whether any given mathematical statement is true or false? Hilbert believed the answer was yes. He believed mathematics was complete and decidable, that every true statement could be proved, and there existed a systematic method for finding that proof. Turing, working at Cambridge in 1935 and 1936, set out to answer this question, and to do it, he needed to define precisely what a mechanical procedure was. What does it actually mean to compute something? And here's where his genius shone through, because instead of getting tangled in abstract definitions, he imagined a machine. Not a real machine, a theoretical one. A thought experiment. Picture an infinitely long strip of tape divided into squares. Each square can hold a symbol, let's say a 1 or a 0, or it can be blank. There's a head that can read the symbol on the current square, write a new symbol, and move one square to the left or one square to the right. And there's a set of rules, a table of instructions, that tells the head what to do based on what it reads and what state it's currently in. That's it. That's the whole machine. Tape, head, rules. This is what we now call a Turing machine, and it sounds almost absurdly simple. But Turing proved something astonishing about it. This simple device can compute anything that is computable. Any calculation, any algorithm, any logical operation that any computer could ever perform. This little imaginary machine with its tape and its head and its rules can do it too, given enough time and enough tape. And then he proved something else, something that answered Hilbert's question. There are some problems that no Turing machine can solve. The halting problem, specifically. You can't build a Turing machine that can look at any other Turing machine and its input and reliably determine whether it will eventually stop or run forever. Mathematics is not decidable. Hilbert was wrong. But for our purposes tonight, the really earth-shaking result is the first one, the universality. Turing showed that there's nothing special about any particular computing machine. If it can do a certain minimal set of operations, it can do everything. And he went further. He described what he called a universal Turing machine, a Turing machine that can simulate any other Turing machine. You feed it a description of another machine on its tape, along with that machine's input, and it faithfully executes whatever that other machine would have done. It's a machine that can be any machine, depending on what instructions you give it. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what a modern computer is. Your laptop, your phone, they're universal machines. They don't have separate physical hardware for every task they perform. They have general-purpose hardware that follows whatever instructions, whatever program you give them. Word processor, video game, weather simulation, music player, same machine, different software. Turing described this concept in 1936 in a paper titled On Computable Numbers, before any programmable electronic computer existed. He was 24. And now something wonderful is about to happen, because Turing's theoretical framework and Shannon's practical insight are going to collide with a world that desperately needs computing power. The late 1930s are tipping into the 1940s, and the Second World War is about to create an almost unlimited demand for calculation, ballistic tables, code breaking, logistics, atomic physics. Governments on both sides of the conflict are about to pour enormous resources into building machines that can think faster than humans, and the theoretical foundations that Turing and Shannon and others have laid down are about to be translated into actual, physical, room-filling hardware. The first real computers are about to be born, and the stories of how they came into existence are tangled up with secrecy, rivalry, and the kind of pressure that only comes when the fate of nations hangs on getting the math right. So let's talk about what actually got built and who built it, and, because this is engineering. What went wrong along the way? The first thing to understand is that there wasn't one single first computer. There were several, being developed in parallel, often in total secrecy in different countries, by people who had no idea what the others were doing. And this matters because it means the same ideas kept being independently discovered, and it means the question of who deserves credit has been fought over for decades. But let's start with the one that history almost forgot entirely. In Germany, in the late 1930s, a young civil engineer named Konrad Zuse was sitting at his desk doing structural calculations by hand and hating every minute of it. Zuse had graduated from the Technische Hochschule in Berlin in 1935, and his job involved endless, repetitive arithmetic, the kind of thing that drove people to madness. And unlike Babbage, who had the same frustration a century earlier, but was surrounded by a rich intellectual tradition of mathematical thinking, Zuse was largely working in isolation. He wasn't deeply plugged into the academic world of mathematical logic. He hadn't read Turing's paper. He may not have even known about Babbage. He just knew that there had to be a better way. So he started building a computing machine in his parents' living room in Berlin in 1936, the same year Turing published his paper in London. Think about that timing for a second. Zuse's first machine, which he called the Z1, was entirely mechanical. Thin metal plates that slid and interlocked to represent binary numbers. And yes, he chose binary. He arrived at that decision independently, reasoning that a system with only 2 states would be far simpler to build mechanically than one with 10 states. Leibniz's old insight, rediscovered by a frustrated engineer with metal scraps and a dream. The Z1 was completed around 1938, and it mostly didn't work. The mechanical parts weren't precise enough. The plates jammed and stuck and gave wrong answers. But the architecture, the concept, was remarkably sophisticated. It had a memory unit and a processing unit, separate from each other. It read instructions from punched film, old 35mm movie film actually, with holes punched in it. It was, in principle, a programmable binary computer. The Z1 was a failure in practice, but a triumph in concept, and Zuse knew it, so he kept going. He replaced the unreliable mechanical switches with electromagnetic relays, the same kind of relay we talked about earlier, the kind Morse and Vail used in the telegraph, the kind Shannon had theorized about. Relays were slower than Zuse might have liked, but they were reliable. They either clicked closed or they didn't. Binary, on or off, 1 or 0. The result was the Z3, completed in May 1941. And here's where things get historically significant. The Z3 was a fully functional, programmable, automatic digital computer that used binary arithmetic and floating point numbers. It could be given a sequence of instructions on punched film, and it would execute them without human intervention. It was, by many definitions, the first working programmable digital computer in history. And almost nobody knew about it because Germany was at war, and Zuse was doing this work with modest government funding, and the German military never fully grasped what they had. The Z3 was eventually destroyed in an Allied bombing raid on Berlin in 1943. Zuse would later rebuild versions of his machines, but by then the world had moved on, and for decades his contributions were barely acknowledged outside of Germany. Now, meanwhile, across the English Channel, something very different and very secret was happening, and this is where Alan Turing re-enters our story in the most dramatic way possible. By 1939, Britain was at war with Germany, and one of the most critical battlefields was invisible. It was the war of information. The German military was encrypting its communications using a machine called Enigma, which was an electromechanical device about the size of a typewriter that scrambled messages using a system of rotating wheels and electrical connections. Each day, the settings would change, which meant that even if you figured out yesterday's key, today you were starting from scratch. The number of possible configurations was astronomical, on the order of 150 million, depending on the version. Breaking Enigma by brute force, trying every combination, was simply impossible for human computers working with pencil and paper. Turing was recruited to the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate about 50 miles north of London that became the nerve center of Britain's code-breaking effort. And what Turing and his colleagues did there, particularly Turing and a brilliant mathematician named Gordon Welchman, was design an electromechanical machine called the bomb. The bomb wasn't a general-purpose computer. It was a special-purpose machine designed to do one thing: find the daily Enigma settings by exploiting logical contradictions. It used the structure of known message formats, things like weather reports that always started with predictable words, to eliminate impossible configurations at enormous speed. Each bomb bay was about 6 feet tall, maybe 7 feet wide, and contained dozens of rotating drums that mimicked the Enigma wheels, spinning through possibilities and testing them electrically. Here's what's beautiful about the bomb from an engineering perspective. It wasn't trying every combination one at a time. It was using logic, Boolean logic in essence, to rule out vast swaths of possibilities simultaneously. If a particular setting led to a contradiction, if it implied that a letter encrypted to itself, which Enigma couldn't do, then that entire branch of possibilities was pruned away. It was a physical embodiment of logical deduction, running on electricity and spinning metal. By 1940, the bombs were operational, and they were breaking Enigma messages regularly. The intelligence this produced, codenamed Ultra, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Historians have argued that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years. Some say more. Thousands of lives, maybe millions, saved because a group of mathematicians and engineers figured out how to make machines think through logical problems faster than any human could. But the Germans had another encryption system that was even more sophisticated than Enigma. It was called the Lorenz cipher, and it was used for the highest level communications, messages between Hitler and his generals. The Lorenz machine was more complex, with 12 rotors instead of Enigma's 3 or 4, and breaking it required a fundamentally different approach. And this is where a man named Tommy Flowers comes in, and where the story takes a leap that changes everything. Tommy Flowers was a telephone engineer at the Post Office Research Station in Dollis Hill, London. He'd spent years working on telephone switching systems, which meant he understood relays intimately. But he'd also been experimenting with something newer: vacuum tubes, also called thermionic valves. A vacuum tube is essentially an electronic switch. It works on the same basic principle as a relay. It can be on or off, conducting or not conducting, but it has no moving parts. It's just electrons flowing through a vacuum inside a glass tube, controlled by a small voltage on a grid. And because there are no mechanical parts to physically move, a vacuum tube can switch on and off thousands of times per second, compared to maybe 10 or 20 times per second for a relay. The problem was that vacuum tubes had a reputation for being unreliable. They burned out. They ran hot. Anyone who's ever seen an old radio with its glowing tubes knows what they look like. These little glass bulbs, warm to the touch, fragile. The conventional wisdom at Bletchley Park was that you couldn't build a machine with thousands of vacuum tubes because too many would fail too often. The machine would spend more time broken than working. Tommy Flowers disagreed. And this is one of those moments in engineering history where one person's stubbornness, born from practical experience, changes the trajectory of technology. Flowers knew from his telephone work that vacuum tubes were actually quite reliable if you treated them right. The main thing that killed tubes was the thermal shock of turning them on and off. The filament would heat up, cool down, heat up, cool down, and eventually crack. Flowers' insight was simple. Just leave them on. Never turn them off. If you kept the tubes running continuously, they'd last for a very long time. It seems obvious in retrospect, but it went against the prevailing practice, and almost nobody believed him. He built the machine anyway, partly with his own money when the official funding was slow to come. The result was Colossus, and it became operational in February 1944, just months before D-Day. Colossus used approximately 1,600 vacuum tubes in its first version, and its successor, Colossus Mark II, used about 2,400. It could read paper tape at 5,000 characters per second. The tape was flying through the machine so fast that the engineers worried about it catching fire from friction. And it worked. It broke the Lorenz cipher. It provided intelligence that directly influenced the Allied invasion of Normandy. Now, Colossus was not a general-purpose computer. Like the Bomba, it was designed for a specific task, cryptanalysis. You couldn't reprogram it to do arbitrary calculations. But it was the first large-scale electronic digital computing device. It proved that Tommy Flowers was right. You could build a reliable machine with thousands of vacuum tubes, and it would be orders of magnitude faster than anything built with relays. That proof of concept mattered enormously, because it showed the world, or it would have if it hadn't been classified top secret for 30 years, that electronics were the future of computing. And this is one of the great tragedies of the story. After the war, the British government ordered most of the Colossus machines destroyed and the documentation burned. The people who worked on them were sworn to secrecy. Tommy Flowers couldn't talk about what he'd done. He couldn't publish papers. He couldn't build on his own work in the public sphere. When other engineers later claimed to have built the first electronic computers, Flowers couldn't say a word. He went back to the post office and continued working on telephone systems, carrying one of the biggest secrets in computing history in silence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans were building their own machines, and they were doing it with a very different set of pressures. The United States Army needed ballistic tables, enormous books of numbers that told artillery crews how to aim their guns. Every combination of shell type, charge weight, elevation angle, wind speed, temperature, and humidity required a separate calculation, and each calculation involved solving differential equations that took a human computer about 40 hours to complete by hand. A single firing table might require thousands of these calculations. The Ballistic Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland had rooms full of human computers, mostly women, many of them mathematicians, grinding through these calculations as fast as they could, and it still wasn't fast enough. New weapons were being deployed faster than the tables could be computed. Artillery was being sent to the front lines without complete firing data, which meant soldiers were aiming their guns based on incomplete information, which meant people were dying. Into this urgent need stepped two men at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering, John Mauchly, a physicist with a vision, and J. Presper Eckert, a brilliant young engineer with an extraordinary talent for hardware design. Mauchly had been thinking about electronic computing for years. He'd visited Iowa State College in 1941 to see a machine built by John Vincent Atanasoff, a physics professor who had constructed a small electronic device called the Atanasoff-Berry computer, or ABC, which could solve systems of linear equations using vacuum tubes. The ABC was limited and not fully programmable, but it demonstrated that vacuum tubes could perform arithmetic, and the visit clearly influenced Mauchly's thinking, though exactly how much has been the subject of a bitter legal dispute that lasted decades and ultimately reshaped who got credit for inventing the electronic computer. In 1973, a federal judge ruled that Mauchly had derived key concepts from Atanasoff's work, effectively invalidating the broad ENIAC patent. But that ruling is more complicated than it sounds, because what Mauchly and Eckert actually built was so far beyond what Atanasoff had done that calling it derivative feels a little unfair. It's like saying the Wright brothers derived their airplane from a kite. There's a thread of connection, sure, but the engineering achievement is in a completely different universe. The ABC could solve one specific type of math problem. What Mauchly and Eckert set out to build was a general-purpose electronic calculator that could handle any numerical problem you threw at it, and they intended to do it at speeds that would make every existing computing method look like scratching numbers in the dirt with a stick. The project was approved in 1943 under the code name Project PX, and the machine they were building would eventually be called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. The Army was funding it, the Moore School was hosting it, and Eckert, who was only 24 years old when the project started, was the chief engineer. Think about that for a second. 24. And he was responsible for making nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes work together reliably in a single machine. At the time, the conventional wisdom in electronics was that vacuum tubes were fragile, unreliable things. A typical tube might last a few thousand hours before burning out, and if you had 18,000 of them, simple probability said that on average, one would fail every few minutes. That would make sustained computation impossible. Eckert's insight, and this was genuinely brilliant, was that most tube failures happened because people ran tubes at their maximum rated voltage. If you deliberately underran them, operating each tube well below its rated capacity, the failure rate dropped dramatically. He also implemented rigorous quality control, testing every single tube before installation, and he designed the circuits so that each tube was doing as little work as possible. It was conservative engineering, in the best sense, not flashy, not pushing limits, but deeply thoughtful about reliability. And it worked. ENIAC, when it was finally operational in late 1945, could perform about 5,000 additions per second. To put that in perspective, a human computer with a desk calculator might manage one addition every few seconds. ENIAC was roughly 1,000 times faster than any other computing device in existence. It filled an entire room, a big room, about 30 feet by 50 feet, and it weighed 30 tons. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to light a small neighborhood. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal, that when ENIAC was turned on, the lights in Philadelphia dimmed. That almost certainly didn't happen, but the fact that people believed it tells you something about the sheer scale of the thing. Now here's what's important to understand about how ENIAC actually worked, because it's different from what you might expect. ENIAC was not a stored program computer. It didn't read instructions from memory the way your laptop does. Instead, it was programmed by physically rewiring it. The machine had 40 separate panels, and to set up a new problem, you had to plug cables into different sockets and flip switches to route data through the right sequence of operations. Programming ENIAC for a new problem could take days. The actual computation might take seconds, but the setup was enormously labor-intensive, and the people who did that programming, the people who figured out how to translate mathematical problems into physical cable configurations, were 6 women: Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlon Westcott, Fran Billis, and Ruth Lichterman. They were originally human computers at the Ballistic Research Laboratory, and they were recruited to program ENIAC because they understood the mathematics. They had to learn the machine from its circuit diagrams. Nobody wrote them a manual, and they essentially invented the discipline of programming as they went. For decades, their contribution was almost completely overlooked. In the famous photographs of ENIAC, they're sometimes visible in the background, but the captions identified only the men. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that historians began to properly recognize what they'd done. So ENIAC was a triumph, but it had this fundamental limitation: the rewiring problem. Every new task meant days of reconfiguration. And even before ENIAC was finished, the people involved were already thinking about how to do better. This is where the story takes one of its most important turns, and it involves a man we haven't talked about yet: John von Neumann. Von Neumann was, by almost any measure, one of the most extraordinary intellects of the 20th century. He was born in Budapest in 1903, and the stories about his childhood genius are the kind that sound made up, but apparently aren't. By age 6, he could divide 8-digit numbers in his head. By age 8, he was familiar with calculus. He had a photographic memory. He could read a page of a book once and recite it back verbatim years later. He made foundational contributions to quantum mechanics, game theory, set theory, economics, and half a dozen other fields before he ever turned his attention to computing. When he walked into the ENIAC project in 1944, he was already one of the most famous scientists in the world, working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton alongside Einstein. Von Neumann had been doing calculations for the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, and he needed enormous computational power for the hydrodynamic simulations involved in implosion design. When he learned about ENIAC, he was immediately fascinated, and he quickly became involved with the team at the Moore School. And here's where things get both revolutionary and controversial. In June 1945, von Neumann wrote a document called First Draft of a Report on the EDVAC being the successor machine to ENIAC that was already being planned. This document described an architecture in which the computer's program would be stored in the same memory as its data. Instead of rewiring the machine for each new problem, you would simply load a different set of instructions into memory. The machine would read those instructions one by one, execute them, and move to the next. The program itself would be just another kind of data. This is the stored program concept, and it's the foundation of virtually every computer built since. Your phone, your laptop, the servers running the internet, the computer in your car, they all work this way. Instructions live in memory alongside data, and the processor fetches and executes them in sequence. It seems obvious now, but in 1945, it was a conceptual leap. Remember Babbage's analytical engine from 100 years earlier? Babbage had separated the store from the mill, and programs came in on punched cards from outside. Von Neumann's insight, or at least the insight described in his report, was that the program should live inside the machine, in the same memory as everything else. That meant the machine could modify its own program. It could make decisions, loop back, branch to different instructions based on results. It made the computer fundamentally more flexible. But here's the controversy. Von Neumann's name was the only one on that first draft. Eckert and Mauchly, who had been developing many of these ideas in conversations with von Neumann, and independently, were furious. They felt that von Neumann had taken collaborative ideas and published them under his own name, which not only denied them credit, but also, because the report was widely circulated, effectively put the ideas into the public domain, undermining their ability to patent them. The dispute poisoned relationships and led to lawsuits and decades of bitterness. Historians still argue about who deserves credit. The honest answer is probably that the stored program concept emerged from conversations among multiple people: von Neumann, Eckert, Mauchly, and others at the Moore School. And von Neumann was the one who wrote it down in a clear, logical, mathematically rigorous way that the rest of the world could understand. His fame ensured it would be read. But it wasn't solely his idea, and the fact that the architecture is universally called the von Neumann architecture is at least partly an accident of how scientific credit works. The person who writes the definitive paper often gets the name, even when the ideas were in the air. What matters for our story, though, is what happened next. The stored program idea spread like wildfire through the small world of people who were thinking about computing in the mid-1940s. In England, several teams raced to build the first working stored program computer. At the University of Manchester, a small prototype called the Manchester Baby, officially the small-scale experimental machine, ran its first program on June 21, 1948. It was tiny by any standard, with a memory that could hold just 32 words of 32 bits each. The first program it ran was a simple mathematical exercise, finding the highest proper factor of a number. It took 52 minutes to get the answer, which a person could have found in seconds. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the instructions were stored in memory, and the machine read and executed them automatically. It worked. The concept was proven. Almost simultaneously, at Cambridge, Maurice Wilkes and his team were building EDSAC, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, which ran its first program in May 1949 and was arguably the first practical stored program computer, meaning it was actually used for real scientific calculations, not just demonstrations. And back in the United States, Eckert and Mauchly had left the Moore School, bitter about the credit dispute and the university's attempt to claim patent rights on their work, and founded their own company to build a commercial computer. That machine would eventually become UNIVAC, and it would change the relationship between computers and the public in a way that nobody quite expected. But before we get there, it's worth pausing on something that was happening inside these machines at the level of the actual hardware, because the technology that made stored program computers practical was about to go through a transformation that would change everything. And I mean everything. So let's talk about vacuum tubes for a second, because up to this point, every electronic computer we've discussed, ENIAC, Colossus, the Manchester Baby, EDSAC, all of them ran on vacuum tubes, and vacuum tubes worked. They could switch on and off fast enough to perform calculations at speeds no mechanical device could touch. But they had problems. Real, practical, maddening problems. You already know about the heat. ENIAC alone consumed around 150 kilowatts of power, enough to run dozens of homes. The tubes burned out constantly. Even with Eckert's clever trick of underrunning them, you were still dealing with thousands of glass bulbs, each one a potential point of failure, each one generating heat, each one drawing power. and the machines were enormous. ENIAC filled a room. The idea that you could ever make these things smaller, cheaper, more reliable, that seemed like a fantasy. If computing was going to stay dependent on vacuum tubes, it was always going to be the province of governments and major universities and big corporations. The machines would always fill rooms. They would always require teams of technicians just to keep them running. But here's what was happening in parallel, in a completely different corner of the technology world. At Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, a team of physicists was working on a problem that had nothing to do with computers. They were trying to build a better amplifier for the telephone network. AT&T's long-distance phone system depended on vacuum tube amplifiers to boost signals across the country, and those tubes were expensive to maintain. They burned out, they consumed power, and they generated heat. The same problems that plagued computers, just in a different context. Bell Labs wanted something better, something solid state, meaning no vacuum, no heated filament, no fragile glass envelope. Just a chunk of material that could amplify a signal. The team working on this problem was led by William Shockley, a brilliant and deeply difficult man. Shockley had been thinking about semiconductor amplifiers since before the war. He knew that certain materials, germanium, silicon, had electrical properties that fell somewhere between conductors like copper and insulators like rubber. These semiconductors could, under the right conditions, be coaxed into controlling the flow of electrical current. The physics was understood in broad strokes, but nobody had managed to build a practical device that actually worked as an amplifier. Shockley assigned two researchers to the problem, John Bardeen and Walter Brattain. Bardeen was a quiet, unassuming theoretical physicist, the kind of person you might not notice at a party, but whose mind was operating on a level that most people couldn't touch. He would go on to win 2 Nobel Prizes, which is almost unheard of. Brattain was the experimentalist, the hands-on guy, the one who could actually build things and make them work in the lab. Together, they were a remarkable pair, and on December 16, 1947, they demonstrated the first working transistor. It was a point-contact transistor, a tiny slab of germanium with 2 gold contacts pressed very close together on its surface. When a small current was applied to one contact, it controlled a much larger current flowing through the other. It amplified. It worked. The thing was barely visible, a crude little assembly of wire and crystal, but it did what a vacuum tube did, only it was tiny. It used almost no power. It generated almost no heat, and it had no filament to burn out. Now, here's where the human drama gets interesting, because Shockley was furious. He was the team leader. He had set the research direction, but Bardeen and Brattain had made the breakthrough without him, and his name wasn't on the patent. This ate at him. So Shockley went away, and in a burst of competitive brilliance, invented a better version, the junction transistor, which was more practical and more manufacturable than the point-contact design. All 3 men would share the 1956 Nobel Prize in Physics, but the personal relationships were poisoned. Shockley's ego and his increasingly erratic behavior would eventually drive Bardeen and Brattain away, and Shockley himself would go on to found Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View, California, in 1956, which is significant because of what happened next. Shockley hired some of the brightest young engineers and physicists in the country, but he was, by most accounts, a terrible manager, paranoid, controlling, dismissive. Within a year, 8 of his best people left to found their own company, Fairchild Semiconductor. They became known as the Traitorous 8 and Shockley never forgave them. But here's the thing. Fairchild Semiconductor became one of the most important companies in the history of technology. And the area around Mountain View and Palo Alto, where all of this was happening, started to accumulate more and more semiconductor companies, spin-offs of spin-offs. That region would eventually get a nickname. You know it. Silicon Valley. The entire geography of the modern technology industry traces back, in a very real sense, to William Shockley's bad management skills and the people who walked away from him. But let's come back to what the transistor meant for computers, because that's really the story here. The first transistorized computer is generally considered to be the Manchester University transistor computer, which ran its first program in November 1953. It used point-contact transistors, and it was modest in capability. But it proved the concept. You could build a computer out of transistors instead of vacuum tubes, and it would be smaller, more reliable, and use far less power. The University of Manchester team, the same group that had built the baby, was once again at the frontier. In the United States, the transition happened quickly. IBM, which had been a major player in computing since the punch card tabulator days, began incorporating transistors into its machines. The IBM 7090, introduced in 1959, was a fully transistorized mainframe that became a workhorse for scientific computing, military applications, and business data processing. It was fast, it was reliable, and it was a massive commercial success. And think about the timeline here. Just 12 years from the first crude transistor demonstration to a fully transistorized commercial mainframe. That's incredibly fast for such a fundamental technology shift. But transistors by themselves, even though they were a huge improvement over vacuum tubes, still had a limitation. Each transistor was a discrete component. You had to manufacture each one individually, then wire them together on a circuit board with resistors and capacitors and all the other components you needed. As circuits got more complex, the wiring got more complex, and you started running into what engineers called the tyranny of numbers. If you wanted to build a more powerful computer, you needed more transistors, which meant more connections, which meant more potential points of failure, more assembly time, more cost. There was a ceiling, and the industry was approaching it fast. And this is where two people, working independently, had essentially the same idea at almost the same time. In the summer of 1958, Jack Kilby, a new engineer at Texas Instruments, was left mostly alone in the lab while his colleagues went on vacation. He hadn't accrued enough vacation time yet. And in that quiet, empty lab, Kilby had an insight. What if you didn't build each component separately and then wire them together? What if you made all the components, transistors, resistors, capacitors, out of the same block of semiconductor material? One piece of germanium, with different regions treated differently to create different electronic functions, all connected together right there on the chip. No separate wiring, no assembly, just one integrated piece. On September 12, 1958, Kilby demonstrated his first integrated circuit. It was rough, a small slab of germanium with gold wires sticking out of it, and it looked almost handmade, because it was. But it worked. A few months later, in January 1959, Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the traitorous 8, independently came up with a similar concept, but using silicon instead of germanium and a different manufacturing technique called the planar process, which was much more suited to mass production. Noyce's version used a layer of silicon oxide as insulation and aluminum traces deposited on top to connect the components, which meant you could manufacture the whole thing using photographic techniques, printing circuits the way you'd print a photograph. Both men have legitimate claims to inventing the integrated circuit, and the patent disputes between Texas Instruments and Fairchild dragged on for years before they eventually cross-licensed their technologies. Kilby would receive the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2000. Noyce had died in 1990 and couldn't share it, which many people felt was a genuine injustice, because Noyce's silicon-based planar approach was arguably the one that changed the world. Think about what the integrated circuit made possible. Instead of wiring together hundreds or thousands of individual transistors by hand, you could now fabricate an entire circuit, with all its transistors and connections, on a single tiny chip of silicon, using a process that was essentially photographic. And here's the key thing. The process for making a chip with 10 transistors was almost the same as the process for making a chip with 100 transistors, or 1,000. The cost didn't scale linearly with complexity. You could make circuits dramatically more complex without dramatically increasing the manufacturing cost. This is where Gordon Moore enters the story. Moore was another one of the traitorous 8, a colleague of Noyce's at Fairchild, and in 1965 he published a short paper in Electronics magazine where he made an observation that would become famous. He noticed that the number of transistors that could be cost-effectively placed on an integrated circuit was doubling roughly every year. He predicted this trend would continue for at least 10 years. Later, the doubling time was revised to roughly every 2 years, and the observation became known as Moore's Law. And here's what's remarkable. It held. For decade after decade, the semiconductor industry kept finding ways to shrink transistors, pack more of them onto a chip, and the exponential growth continued. It wasn't really a law of physics. It was more like a self-fulfilling prophecy, a target that the entire industry organized itself around. Engineers would look at where Moore's Law said they should be in 5 years, and they would figure out how to get there. And the consequences were staggering. In 1971, Intel, the company that Moore and Noyce had founded after leaving Fairchild, released the Intel 4004, which is generally considered the first commercially available microprocessor. A microprocessor is essentially an entire computer processor on a single chip. The 4004 had about 2,300 transistors and could perform roughly 60,000 operations per second. Compare that to ENIAC, which filled a room and had 18,000 vacuum tubes. The 4004 was a sliver of silicon smaller than your fingernail, and while it wasn't as fast as ENIAC for raw number crunching, it was a complete processor, arithmetic, control logic, everything, on one chip. And it cost a fraction of what any previous computer had cost. The 4004 was designed for a Japanese calculator company, Busicom, which tells you something about how the market was thinking at the time. Nobody at Intel initially grasped just how general purpose this thing could be. But one of the chip's designers, Ted Hoff, had pushed for a general purpose architecture rather than a specialized one, and that decision turned out to be pivotal, because once you had a general purpose processor on a single chip, you could use it for anything. Calculators, sure, but also traffic lights, microwave ovens, medical instruments, toys, cars, and eventually, personal computers. The progression from the 4004 forward is almost dizzying. The Intel 8008 came in 1972, with 3,500 transistors. The 8080 in 1974, with 4,500 transistors, became the brain of the Altair 8800, which is often called the first personal computer. It was sold as a kit through Popular Electronics magazine in 1975, and a young Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote a basic interpreter for it, founding a little company called Microsoft in the process. Then the 8086 in 1978, the chip that launched the x86 architecture still running in most desktop and laptop computers today. Each generation, more transistors, faster speeds, lower costs. The curve just kept climbing. And all of this, every bit of it, traces back through a chain of ideas and inventions that we've been following all night. The stored program concept that von Neumann formalized and that the Manchester baby proved. The Boolean logic that Shannon showed could be implemented in electrical circuits. The universal machine that Turing imagined on paper. The transistor that Bardeen and Bratton coaxed out of a sliver of germanium in a quiet lab in New Jersey. The integrated circuit that Kilby built alone during a Texas summer while everyone else was on vacation. Each breakthrough made the next one possible, and each one depended on everything that came before. But there's a piece of this story we haven't really talked about yet, and it might be the most important piece of all, because hardware, no matter how fast or how small, is just potential. It's the software that tells it what to do. And the story of how we learned to talk to these machines, how we went from rewiring plug boards to writing code in languages that almost look like English, that's a story with its own heroes, its own disasters, and its own quiet revolutions. It starts, in a way, with a problem that the ENIAC programmers knew intimately: the sheer tedium of translating human intentions into something the machine could actually execute. Because here's what programming ENIAC was really like. You didn't write code. You didn't type commands. You physically rerouted the machine. The 6 women who programmed ENIAC, Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlon Meltzer, Fran Belis, and Ruth Lichterman, they had to study the machine's logical diagrams, figure out which of the 40 panels needed to be connected to which other panels, and then spend days plugging cables and flipping switches to set up a single computation. If you wanted the machine to do something different, you essentially had to rewire it. Every new problem meant a new physical configuration. It was engineering at the most literal level. Your program existed as a tangle of patch cords, not as something written on paper. Now, once stored program machines came along, the Manchester Baby, EDSAC, and their successors, the situation improved enormously, because now your instructions lived in memory alongside your data. You didn't have to rewire anything, but the instructions themselves were still brutally low level. You were writing in machine code, raw binary numbers, or at best, their hexadecimal equivalents. Each instruction was a numeric code that told the processor to do one tiny thing: load this value from this memory address, add it to the value in this register, store the result over there. To write even a simple program, you had to keep track of exact memory addresses, manage every register by hand, and think in terms of the machine's own internal architecture. It was like giving someone driving directions not in terms of street names and landmarks, but in terms of individual muscle movements. Contract your right quadricep by this much, rotate the steering column 14 degrees clockwise, now release pressure on the brake pedal at a rate of... You get the idea. It worked, but it was agonizing, and it was incredibly error-prone. The first big step away from that agony was assembly language, and it seems almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Instead of writing the numeric operation code for add, you just wrote the word add. Instead of remembering that a jump instruction was binary pattern 11001010, you wrote JMP. A program called an assembler then translated those human-readable mnemonics back into the binary codes the machine actually understood. It was a one-to-one translation. Each assembly instruction corresponded to exactly one machine instruction. So you weren't really gaining any abstraction. You were still thinking at the machine's level. But you could read your own code, and that mattered more than you might think. The earliest assemblers appeared in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and they were written by people who were tired of making mistakes because they'd misremembered a numeric code. It was a practical, almost impatient innovation. People wanted to stop counting in binary and start using words. But the real revolution, the one that changed everything about how humans relate to computers, was the invention of high-level programming languages and the compilers that made them possible. And this is where we meet one of the most remarkable people in computing history, someone who deserves to be as famous as Turing or von Neumann, but often isn't. Grace Murray Hopper. Hopper was a mathematician who joined the Navy during World War II and ended up working on the Harvard Mark I, one of the early electromechanical computers. She was sharp, practical, and impatient with unnecessary difficulty. And in the early 1950s, while working at the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation, the same company Eckert and Mauchly had founded after leaving the ENIAC project, she had an idea that many of her colleagues thought was simply impossible. She wanted to write a program that would take instructions written in something close to English and automatically translate them into machine code. A compiler. The idea was that instead of writing ADD and JMP and managing memory addresses yourself, you could write something like, compute the total of sales, and the compiler would figure out what machine instructions were needed to make that happen. Here's the thing. When she proposed this, people told her she was wrong. Not that it was a bad idea, but that it literally couldn't be done. The common wisdom was that computers could only work with numbers, so you couldn't use them to process words or symbolic expressions. Which, if you think about it for a second, doesn't quite hold up, because everything in a computer is already encoded as numbers, including the characters in text. But the mental model at the time was that programming was a mathematical activity, and the idea of a program that wrote other programs felt circular and strange. Hopper later said that she had a working compiler for about 3 years before anyone would believe it actually worked. Her first compiler, called A0, appeared in 1952. It was more of a linker and loader than what we'd call a compiler today, but it established the principle. A program could translate human-friendly notation into machine code. By 1957, her team had developed Flowmatic, which was designed specifically for business data processing and used English-like syntax. You could write statements like, multiply price by quantity, giving total. And Flowmatic became one of the direct ancestors of COBOL, the Common Business-Oriented Language, which was standardized in 1959 and became one of the most widely used programming languages in history. COBOL is still running today, by the way. Enormous amounts of banking, insurance, and government infrastructure still depend on COBOL programs written decades ago. There's a good chance that the last time you withdrew money from an ATM, a COBOL program was involved somewhere in the chain. Meanwhile, on the scientific computing side, something equally important was happening. In 1957, IBM released Fortran, short for Formula Translation, developed by a team led by John Backus. Fortran let scientists and engineers write programs using mathematical notation that looked much closer to the equations they were already comfortable with. Instead of dozens of assembly instructions to compute a mathematical formula, you could just write the formula. The Fortran compiler would then translate it into optimized machine code. And here's what's really clever. Backus and his team spent enormous effort making sure the compiled code was almost as efficient as handwritten assembly. This was crucial, because the biggest objection to high-level languages was that they'd produce slow, bloated code. If Fortran programs had run significantly slower than hand-coded assembly, nobody would have used it. But the compiler was good enough that the convenience was worth the tiny performance cost, and Fortran took off. It's still in active use today, particularly in scientific computing, weather modeling, and physics simulations. A language from 1957, still earning its keep. So by the late 1950s, you had this fundamental shift. Programming was no longer something that required you to think like the machine. You could start thinking like a human, expressing your intentions in terms of business logic or mathematical formulas, and let the compiler worry about the translation. This was an enormous democratization. You no longer needed to understand the intimate details of a specific processor's architecture to write useful software. And that meant more people could program, which meant more software got written, which meant computers became useful for more things, which drove demand for more computers, which drove the hardware improvements we talked about earlier. Software and hardware were feeding each other in a virtuous cycle. But languages kept evolving because programmers kept running into new problems. In the 1960s, as programs grew larger and more complex, people started struggling with a very human problem: organization. When your program is 100 lines long, you can keep it all in your head. When it's 10,000 lines, you can't. When it's 100,000 lines, which became common for large systems, you need some way to structure the code so that different pieces don't interfere with each other, so that you can change one part without accidentally breaking something else, so that multiple programmers can work on the same project without stepping on each other's toes. This led to what's sometimes called the software crisis. In 1968, a NATO conference on software engineering brought together experts who were alarmed at the state of the industry. Large software projects were routinely late, over budget, and full of bugs. The term software engineering was itself partly aspirational. The argument was that building software needed to become more like engineering and less like improvisation. The problems weren't really about the computers. The computers worked fine. The problems were about human cognition, our limited ability to manage complexity. Out of this crisis came new ideas about how to structure programs. Structured programming, championed by Edsger Dijkstra, argued against the chaotic use of Goto statements, instructions that let you jump to any arbitrary point in your code, and in favor of clean control structures like loops and conditionals. Dijkstra's famous 1968 letter, "Go to Statement Considered Harmful," is one of the most influential short pieces ever written about programming. His argument was essentially that unrestrained jumping around in code made programs almost impossible to reason about. If you couldn't trace the flow of execution in your head, you couldn't be confident the program was correct. Structured programming gave you discipline, a way to write code whose flow you could actually follow. Then came object-oriented programming, which took organization to another level. The core idea, first explored in Simula, a Norwegian language from the 1960s, created by Ole Johan Dahl and Kristen Nygaard, and later popularized by Smalltalk at Xerox PARC in the 1970s, was that you could model your program as a collection of objects, each one bundling together data and the operations that work on that data. Think of it like this. Instead of having a big pile of variables over here and a big pile of functions over there, you group related things together. A bank account object knows its own balance and knows how to process a deposit or withdrawal. A weather sensor object knows its own readings and knows how to calibrate itself. Each object is a self-contained little world, and objects communicate by sending messages to each other. This made it much easier to build large systems because you could think about one object at a time without worrying about everything else. These ideas, structured programming, object-oriented design, and many others, weren't just academic exercises. They were responses to real pain, real projects that failed, real bugs that cost millions of dollars, real systems that collapsed under their own complexity. The Therec 25 radiation therapy machine in the 1980s killed patients because of software errors that were partly rooted in poor code structure and inadequate testing. The 1996 explosion of the Ariane 5 rocket, just 37 seconds after launch, was caused by a software error, a data conversion overflow inherited from code written for the earlier Ariane 4, reused without adequate review. A $500 million rocket destroyed by a bug. These disasters drove home the point that software wasn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. It controlled real things in the real world, and when it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. And this is what makes the story of software so fascinating and so different from the hardware story. Hardware follows physics. You can test a bridge with math before you build it. You can calculate the stress on a beam. But software is pure logic, pure human thought, crystallized into instructions. And the failure modes are the failure modes of human thinking itself. Assumptions you didn't question, edge cases you didn't imagine, interactions between components that nobody predicted. The challenge of software engineering is, at its core, the challenge of managing the complexity of our own ideas. By the 1980s and 1990s, programming languages had proliferated wildly. C, developed by Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs in the early 1970s, became the backbone of systems programming. Unix was written in C, and eventually most operating systems were. C gave you power and speed, but also enough rope to hang yourself, as programmers like to say, because it let you manipulate memory directly, which was efficient but dangerous. C++, created by Bjarne Stroustrup, added object-oriented features to C Java, released by Sun Microsystems in 1995, promised write once, run anywhere. Your program would run on any machine that had a Java virtual machine, regardless of the underlying hardware. Python, created by Guido van Rossum in 1991, prioritized readability and simplicity, and eventually became one of the most popular languages in the world, especially for data science and machine learning. Each language represented a different philosophy about the trade-offs between speed, safety, readability, and flexibility. And underneath all of them, no matter how elegant or abstract the code looked on the surface, the compiler or interpreter was still translating everything down into the same basic operations: move this data, add these numbers, compare these values, jump to this instruction. The same fundamental operations that the ENIAC programmers had set up by hand with patch cords in 1945. The layers of abstraction had grown enormously, but at the bottom of the stack, the logic was still Boolean, the arithmetic was still binary, and the machine was still doing exactly what Turing had described in 1936, reading symbols, following rules, moving to the next state. Which brings us to something that started quietly in the 1940s and 1950s, but has become, in our own time, perhaps the most consequential question in all of computing. Because almost as soon as people built machines that could follow logical instructions, they started asking a deceptively simple question. Could a machine actually think? Not just calculate, not just follow rules, but genuinely think, reason, learn, understand. And the story of how people tried to answer that question, the breakthroughs and the spectacular dead ends, and the sudden explosion of capability in our own era. That story starts with a paper that Alan Turing published in 1950, just a couple of years after the Manchester Baby ran its first program. A paper with the wonderfully understated title, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which he proposed a way to sidestep the whole messy philosophical debate about consciousness and instead replace it with something practical, something testable. Turing's argument was elegant in its simplicity. He said, look, we don't really know what thinking means. We can't even define it precisely for humans. When you talk to another person, you don't actually have direct access to their inner experience. You infer that they're thinking based on what they say, how they respond, how they behave. So why not apply the same standard to a machine? He proposed what he called the imitation game, though we know it today as the Turing test. The setup is straightforward. You have a human judge sitting at a terminal, communicating through text with two hidden participants, one human, one machine. The judge asks questions, reads the responses, and tries to figure out which one is the machine. If the machine can fool the judge consistently, if its responses are indistinguishable from a human's, then Turing argued, we have no good reason to deny that the machine is, in some meaningful sense, thinking. Now, he wasn't saying the machine would be conscious. He wasn't claiming it would have feelings or subjective experience. He was making a much more careful point that if the observable behavior is indistinguishable from thinking, then the question of whether it's really thinking becomes a philosophical puzzle, not a scientific one. And he anticipated almost every objection people would raise. The paper is remarkable for that. He went through them one by one. The theological objection, that thinking is a function of the soul. The mathematical objection, based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The argument from consciousness, that a machine can't truly understand. Lady Lovelace's objection, which remember we talked about earlier, that a machine can only do what it's programmed to do, and therefore can never originate anything. Turing had responses to all of them. Some of his responses were stronger than others, but the paper laid out the intellectual framework for everything that followed. And here's what's important about the timing. In 1950, when Turing wrote this, the most powerful computers in the world had a few thousand bytes of memory. They could barely play a simple game of chess. The idea that a machine might someday carry on a convincing conversation seemed almost absurdly far-fetched. But Turing wasn't talking about what machines could do in 1950. He was talking about what they might do in principle, given enough time and enough capability. He even made a prediction. He guessed that by the year 2000, a machine with about 100 megabytes of storage could fool a human judge about 30% of the time in a 5-minute conversation. That's a remarkably specific prediction, and it turned out to be roughly in the right ballpark, depending on how you measure it. But the real explosion of activity around artificial intelligence, and this is where the term itself comes from, happened a few years later. In the summer of 1956, a group of researchers gathered at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, for a workshop that would define the field. The organizers were John McCarthy, a young mathematician at Dartmouth, Marvin Minsky, who was at Harvard, Nathaniel Rochester from IBM, and Claude Shannon, the same Shannon whose master's thesis had connected Boolean logic to electrical circuits back in 1937. McCarthy coined the term artificial intelligence specifically for this workshop, partly because he wanted a fresh name that wouldn't be associated with existing fields like cybernetics or automata theory. He wanted something new, something bold. The Dartmouth workshop was small, maybe 10 or 20 people over the course of the summer, but the ambition was extraordinary. The proposal McCarthy wrote is almost breathtaking in its optimism. It essentially said, we think that every aspect of learning, every feature of intelligence, can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. And they believed it could be done quickly. There was a genuine sense that the fundamental problems of AI, getting machines to use language, form abstractions, solve problems, improve themselves, might be cracked within a generation. And for a while, the progress seemed to justify that optimism. In the late 1950s and 1960s, researchers built programs that could do genuinely impressive things. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon created the logic theorist, which could prove mathematical theorems from Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. It actually found a more elegant proof of one theorem than the one in the original book. They followed it with the general problem solver, which tried to mimic the way humans approach problems by breaking them into sub-goals. Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT created ELIZA in 1966, a chatbot that simulated a Rogerian psychotherapist by using simple pattern matching to turn your statements back into questions. You'd type, "I'm feeling sad," and ELIZA would respond, "Why do you say you are feeling sad?" It was a parlor trick, really, but people were astonished by how convincing it felt. Some of Weizenbaum's own students reportedly wanted to have private conversations with the program. That disturbed him deeply, actually. He spent much of his later career warning about the dangers of people attributing understanding to machines that had none. But here's the thing about that early era of AI. The methods that worked brilliantly on toy problems, small, well-defined puzzles in controlled environments, fell apart completely when you tried to scale them up to the real world. This is sometimes called the problem of combinatorial explosion. A program that could play perfect tic-tac-toe couldn't play decent chess because the number of possible positions grew so astronomically fast that no amount of computing power could search through them all. A system that could understand simple English sentences in a limited domain, like Terry Winograd's SHRDLU from 1970, which could discuss and manipulate blocks on a virtual table, couldn't handle the ambiguity and context dependence of real human language. The real world turned out to be vastly, incomprehensibly more complicated than the early AI pioneers had imagined. And so the field hit a wall. By the mid-1970s, the promises hadn't been kept. Funding agencies, particularly in the UK and the US, grew skeptical. In 1973, the British mathematician James Lighthill published a devastating report for the UK Science Research Council, arguing that AI had failed to achieve its grandiose objectives and that the field's promises were largely unfounded. Funding dried up. Researchers moved to other areas. This period became known as the first AI winter, and it lasted through much of the late 1970s. There was a brief revival in the 1980s around something called expert systems, programs that encoded the knowledge of human specialists as large collections of if-then rules. If the patient has a fever and a stiff neck and a rash, then consider meningitis. Companies spent millions building these systems for medical diagnosis, mineral exploration, financial analysis. For a while, it seemed like this was the path forward. You just needed to capture enough human knowledge in enough rules. But expert systems turned out to be brittle. They couldn't handle situations their rules didn't cover. They couldn't learn from experience. They couldn't deal with uncertainty gracefully. And they were enormously expensive to build and maintain because every piece of knowledge had to be hand-coded by human experts working with knowledge engineers. By the late 1980s, the expert systems boom had collapsed, and AI entered its second winter. Now, during these winters, important work was still happening, quietly, in university labs. And one thread in particular would eventually change everything. It involved an idea that had been around since the very beginning of AI but had fallen out of favor: artificial neural networks. The basic concept is inspired loosely by the brain. You have simple processing units, artificial neurons, connected together in a network. Each connection has a weight, a number that represents how strongly one neuron influences another. You feed data in at one end, it propagates through the network, and you get an output at the other end. The key insight is that you can adjust those weights automatically using a learning algorithm, so the network gradually gets better at whatever task you're training it on. The idea goes back to 1943, when Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts published a paper showing that networks of simple threshold units could compute logical functions. Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell built the perceptron in 1958, a physical machine that could learn to classify simple patterns. It got tremendous press coverage. The New York Times ran a story suggesting the Navy had built an electronic brain. But in 1969, Minsky and Seymour Papert published a book called Perceptrons that proved mathematically that single-layer networks couldn't solve certain important problems. Specifically, they couldn't learn the XOR function, a basic logical operation. The book is often blamed for killing neural network research for over a decade, though Minsky later said that wasn't his intention. What revived neural networks was a technique called backpropagation, a way to train networks with multiple layers by calculating how much each weight contributed to the overall error and adjusting them accordingly. The math had been discovered and rediscovered several times, but it was a 1986 paper by David Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams that really brought it to the attention of the AI community. Suddenly you could train deeper networks with hidden layers between the input and output, and these deeper networks could learn much more complex patterns. But even then, the computers of the 1980s and 1990s weren't powerful enough to train really large networks on really large data sets. So neural networks remained one approach among many, useful for certain problems, but not dominant. What changed, and this is where the story arrives at our own time, was a convergence of three things that happened gradually and then all at once. First, the internet generated enormous quantities of data: text, images, video, click patterns, search queries. Suddenly there was more training data available than anyone had ever imagined. Second, computing power increased dramatically, and in particular, researchers discovered that graphics processing units, GPUs, originally designed to render video game graphics, were extraordinarily good at the kind of parallel matrix arithmetic that neural network training requires. A single modern GPU could do work that would have taken a room full of 1990s computers. And third, researchers figured out architectural innovations that made very deep networks practical. In 2012, a neural network called AlexNet, built by Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever in Geoffrey Hinton's lab at the University of Toronto, won the ImageNet image recognition competition by a stunning margin, using a deep convolutional neural network trained on GPUs. That result sent a shockwave through the field. Deep learning, as it came to be called, wasn't just incrementally better. It was dramatically, unmistakably better at recognizing images than anything that had come before. And then things moved fast. Deep learning conquered one domain after another: speech recognition, machine translation, game playing. In 2016, a system called AlphaGo, built by DeepMind, defeated Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in history, a feat that experts had predicted was still decades away. The game of Go has more possible positions than there are atoms in the observable universe, so brute force search was never going to work. AlphaGo learned by studying millions of human games and then playing millions more against itself. But perhaps the most consequential development, the one that brought AI into the everyday awareness of billions of people, came from a particular architecture called the Transformer, introduced in a 2017 paper by researchers at Google with the memorable title, "Attention is All You Need." The Transformer architecture was specifically designed for processing sequences, like sentences, and its key innovation was a mechanism called self-attention, which allows the model to weigh the relevance of every word in a sentence to every other word, all at once, in parallel. This made it far more efficient to train on large amounts of text than previous approaches. And when researchers at OpenAI and Google and other labs scaled transformers up, training them on vast portions of the internet's text with billions and then hundreds of billions of parameters, those adjustable weights we talked about, something remarkable happened. The models started exhibiting capabilities that nobody had explicitly programmed. They could write coherent essays, translate between languages, write code, answer questions, reason through problems. The large language models, as they're called, seemed to be doing something that looked from the outside an awful lot like understanding. And this is where we circle all the way back to Turing's 1950 paper, because the question he asked, "Can a machine think?" is no longer a theoretical exercise. It's a practical question that millions of people are grappling with right now every time they interact with one of these systems. And the honest answer is that we still don't really know. These models are doing something extraordinary, but whether it constitutes genuine understanding or is an incredibly sophisticated form of pattern matching, well, that's the debate of our era, and it's far from settled. What we do know is this: every time you ask a large language model a question and it responds with something that seems insightful, the answer was produced by billions of simple arithmetic operations, multiplications and additions, performed on numbers, in binary, by transistors etched into silicon at scales measured in nanometers, switching on and off billions of times per second. The same binary that Leibniz wrote about in 1679. The same Boolean logic that George Boole formalized in the 1850s. The same electrical switching that Shannon connected to logic gates in 1937. The same stored program architecture that von Neumann described in 1945. The same fundamental computation that Turing proved was universal in 1936. Layer after layer of human ingenuity, each generation building on the last, from the abacus to the transistor, to the microprocessor to the neural network. And that, when you think about it, is maybe the most remarkable thing of all. Not any single invention, but the continuity. The unbroken thread that connects a Babylonian accountant pressing a stylus into wet clay to keep track of grain shipments, to Ada Lovelace imagining a machine that could compose music, to 6 women plugging patch cords into ENIAC, to Grace Hopper insisting that computers should understand English, to a teenager today asking an AI to help them with their homework. Every step along the way, someone looked at what existed and asked, what if we could make this do a little more? What if we could make it a little smarter, a little faster, a little more flexible? And the answer, every time, turned out to be yes, but never in the way anyone predicted, and always with consequences nobody fully anticipated. So as you're lying there, maybe drifting off, maybe already half asleep, think about this. Your phone, sitting on your nightstand or tucked under your pillow, contains more computing power than everything that existed on Earth in 1965 combined, and it's running software written in languages that descend from Fortran and COBOL, compiled into machine code, executed on processors whose architecture traces back to the Intel 4004, built from transistors whose lineage goes back to that piece of germanium in a Bell Labs workshop in 1947, implementing logic gates that do exactly what Shannon described in his thesis, performing computations that are, at the deepest level, exactly what Turing's abstract machine does, reading symbols, following rules, moving to the next state. All of human computing history, all those centuries of ingenuity and argument and failure and breakthrough, compressed into a thin rectangle of glass and metal that you carry in your pocket without thinking about it. And that's a pretty good thought to fall asleep to. The idea that every piece of technology around you is a love letter from the past, written by thousands of people you'll never meet, each one adding their line to a story that's still being written. Sleep well.